Yes, indeed.
Handed over that thing, your dark soul, for my lady's painting.
Unlike many of the other games I've played, I don't actually know when I first heard about Dark Souls. It was much earlier than when I first played it, but I don't actually know when that really was. However, I do know what the first Souls thing I saw was. It was an image on my For You page on Instagram sometime in the early 2010s. Probably around 2013, but it could have been 2014 or even 2012 for all I know. That image was of a sun with a knight below it, the knight raising his arms up, seemingly stretching out to embrace all the light from that sun. This image is one that I distinctly remember from back then, and it is one that I don't think I will ever forget. I didn't know it then, but that night and that sun would become one of the most meaningful symbols of a game series that I and millions of others have loved for years. My story with the Souls series truly began 7 years ago in the early months of 2016. It was during a time when Destiny and Call of Duty were my go-to games to play. Back then, I didn't play games the same way I do now. I played what I wanted and didn't branch out from there. That was until one day in February when a friend of mine asked me if I wanted to get a game for free. Him and another friend of ours were already familiar with Dark Souls, and they were eagerly awaiting the release of Dark Souls 3. He had pre-ordered the game and, as a result, received a code for a free copy of Dark Souls 1 for Xbox. He already had the game, so he extended the code to me, wanting to play it with me once he finished Dark Souls 3. At the time, I was really only interested in it because of the big fat M for mature rating the game had, knowing it would be another chance to go behind my mom's back and play the quote, cool games. Taking the offer, I got the code and downloaded the game. I didn't actually start playing the game for a couple of months though, until April 10th to be exact. It was on that day that, with the help of my friend, I started playing one of the games that would shape my life the most going forward, beginning a long-time love for a series of games that I cannot and will not forget. I would like to take this moment to thank my friend for getting me into the series. Without him, I likely wouldn't have played Dark Souls until I was 18 or so. I also wouldn't have branched out to other games that I love. So I give my heartfelt thanks to you, and you know who you are. Online, my friend goes by the name Ridden. He makes music and has a passion for his craft and for his friends. The dude is genuinely a wonderful person, and I don't know where I would be without him. I'll have links to his Spotify in the description, so please check him out if you want to hear his stuff. Guided by my friend and nothing else, I set off into the world of Lordran. I had never played anything like Dark Souls before this, so I was very shaky starting out. I remember dying to the Asylum Demon probably 10 or 12 times before finally beating him. Entering into Firelink Shrine for the first time is an experience I will never forget. Flying down and being dropped right next to the bonfire, resting and watching my Estus flasks double. I remember distinctly being told to attack Petrus because my friend thought I had made my way up to the first set of hollows when I told him there was a guy with a shield in my way. I don't think I actually killed him until I was past Anor Londo, but I could be wrong. Going forward into Undeadburg, I was finally let go to explore on my own. I was told where the undead merchant was and where to head next, but past that, I was completely on my own except for a few moments here and there. I was stuck in Undeadburg for a long time until I finally beat the Taurus demon and was able to continue onwards to the Pale Gargoyles. Except I didn't make it there just yet. First, I farmed for the prime weapon of any first-time Souls player, the Drake Sword. This would become my main weapon until I got to Anor Londo. Honestly, past this point, I don't remember anything too significant happening. I killed the gargoyles, went to Lower Undeadburg, swore a bunch at the Capra demon, and went to the depths. From there, it was the normal way to Quelaag, getting killed probably hundreds of times on the way because Blighttown is such a well-made area. I soon hit my first real wall in the game when I got to Sen's Fortress. It was here that I needed a bit of help from summons to really get through a significant portion of the game. Sen's probably took about a week worth of attempts before I beat it, getting to my next wall, or at least my next set of walls, those all being in Anor Londo. I sucked at this place when I started out. It took me 2 days to get past the rafters and another 3 days to beat the Silver Knight archers. I distinctly remember yelling out with joy when I finally got past them. The first section of the cathedral had me stuck for a few hours until I was able to get past it, unlocking the shortcut to the biggest wall I've ever had in the Souls series, that wall being Ornstein and Smo. I'm not going to go too in-depth about good old ONS. They had me stuck for just barely under a month. Each day I made an attempt to beat them, and each day I was defeated. I even walked all the way back to Firelink Shrine to get the Rite of Kindling just to max out my flasks to increase my survival, but it was to no avail. I only ended up beating them when I was able to summon someone to do it for me. I summoned dozens of people, but none were any help and most died in their attempts to help. We got close a few times, but it was never enough. I tried getting my friends to help, but in good old Dark Souls fashion, we weren't able to get each other summoned because the connection never worked. One day, however, one of my summons was successful. This summon was using a red Tearstone Ring combo with the Black Knight Greatsword. He absolutely destroyed ONS and got me past the biggest roadblock I've ever had in a Souls game. Sure, the victory wasn't really mine, but I was past the boss keeping me down the most. Moving forward, I collected the Lord Vessel and went on to the end of the game. I don't really have much to say about the other endgame bosses or areas. Most were lackluster to me or didn't really get me all that stuck. Nito and the Four Kings were the worst of the four, but they really didn't slow me down. The game still hadn't clicked with me at this point. I was only using what I could find from YouTube searches for strong Dark Souls stuff, which at the time was fairly misleading. Gwyn was my next big hurdle, taking me just shy of 2 weeks to kill, once again with a summon doing most of the work. Gwyn fell, and I left the kiln, choosing the dark ending because I did not know what I was doing, finishing the game officially on September 9th, 2016. Now, there's a lot that I just glossed over with this first playthrough, and that is because the game hadn't clicked with me once during my entire playthrough. I was guided nearly the entire time by my friend, and different tasks took months to complete because I would stop and play Destiny on most of the days that I could get on my Xbox. Nearly 2 months passed in between the 2 Bells of Awakening, and over 2 months passed between the start of the game and the first spell. A lot of this was because, really, I didn't care that much about the game. I did care later. I cared a whole lot later. But at the beginning, I just played it because I wanted to play it with my friend. Later on, though, I began to run through New Game Plus, and gradually the game started to stick with me. I began to care and enjoy the game for what it was. I began to refine my skills, overcoming many of the obstacles the game had presented to me by myself, all except for 2. Those once again being Ornstein and Smo, and Gwyn. Despite me getting better at the game and being completely unguided, Dark Souls still hadn't clicked yet. I brute forced my way through most bosses and got stuck in both places I had in my first run. Beating ONS once again with a summon, and Gwyn never. That's right, I never actually beat my second Souls run. This is a trend that has stuck with each game up until Bloodborne. To this day, nearly 7 years later, I am still stuck at Gwyn on the original Prepare to Die version of the game. I could go back at any time and finish it, but I won't. I don't want to finish it. I would like that run to stay unfinished as a testament to my first escapade through Dark Souls. Inexperienced, naive, and ignorant to the tools the game provided me with. A time that I have largely gotten over. I really started to love Dark Souls on my 3rd, 4th, and 5th runs of the game. all of which I accomplished between October and December of 2016. This was when Dark Souls 1 finally clicked for me. I would like to emphasize that Dark Souls 1 clicked for me, not Dark Souls as a whole. I was able to take on any challenge that Dark Souls provided for me, but I still hadn't grasped the point of the gameplay. Dodging instead of blocking, learning movesets, and making builds were still all very foreign to me. For now, it was Christmas Day of 2016, and I would receive my next game in the Souls franchise, that game being Dark Souls 3. This would be the game that would sink me all the way into the series, and the game that helped me to love Dark Souls 1 even more. Dark Souls 3 was the first game in the series that I actively sought out to play, which isn't saying much because Dark Souls 1 was the only one that I didn't do that for. Knowing that my other friends still played the game and wanting to see what was next in the series, I set out on a journey to ask my mom for a very special Christmas gift. That gift being the thing that I just mentioned like 3 times. Somehow, someway, I managed to get Dark Souls 3 for Christmas despite the M rating. I still don't know exactly how I got that pulled off, but here we are. On Christmas Day of 2016, I set out on my adventure through Lothric, fighting past the enemies with ease, using my experience from Dark Souls 1 to carry me through the opening act of the game. Just kidding, I got absolutely demolished by the high wall. It took me almost a week to get past it. The Souls formula still hadn't clicked with me, and that was on clear display here. The game was brutal to me, the slow combat of Dark Souls 1 not being seen anywhere in the opening moments of the third game. I was out of depth once again and submersed in an entirely new challenge, a challenge that I would eventually overcome, but not without help. I'm pretty sure that I used more summons in Dark Souls 3 than any other game in the entire franchise. They were essentially my crutch up until I actually got the formula to click with me. There isn't much to say about my first run through Dark Souls 3. I struggled here and there, but I loved it. The significance of Dark Souls 3 for me is through its bosses. They are what carry this game for me. My first wall boss was Pontiff Sullivan, spending over 2 months on him before finally taking him down with the help of 3 summons, and pure luck. Those 2 months condensed down to maybe a week or so worth of attempts, if I'm being generous, so the number of attempts still doesn't beat out good old ONS. Beating him, I went on to Aldrich, who was my favorite boss of the game for several years up until I finally fought Midir and changed my tier list just to put Aldrich in B tier and Midir in S tier. I didn't beat Aldrich for a while, actually. First, I went and took on Yorm, who went down easy. After that, I put the game down for a while to enjoy the Rise of Iron DLC for Destiny 1. After that hiatus, though, I eventually took on and beat Aldrich, immediately getting myself stuck again. The next boss up was the Dancer of the Boreal Valley, and she almost blew ONS out of the water. Today, I'm not really worried about taking her on. I've beaten her before Vort a few times, actually. But back in that first run, she was terrifying to me. Even with my friends coming to help out, feeding me embers and sticking with me for just under 3 weeks worth of attempts, I simply couldn't beat her. Eventually we got her down using help from a 3rd summon, but it was a massive uphill battle, and I was so happy to be over with her. I had a similar experience with the Twin Princes, but they only took about a week or so before they went down. From there, it was just the final boss left, and I took the Soul of Cinder out a month after the Princes. Once again, not because of any struggle, but because I was developing Stockholm Syndrome with Destiny, and was about to walk into the biggest disappointment of my entire life. After beating Dark Souls 3, I went on to binge it, playing through the game over and over again until I had every ending and nearly every achievement. I went through various New Game Plus cycles until I finally couldn't beat the Abyss Watchers at New Game 6. Like my second run of Dark Souls, I know I could do it if I go back to it now, but I don't want to. My appreciation for this game and the first game because of it has shaped how I've viewed the entire series up until now. Seeing how far the series was able to go in just 5 years was really amazing. Unlike Dark Souls 1, I didn't really play Dark Souls 3 that much after I finished my binge. I've done several runs through the game, and I beat it annually, but it is still my least played Dark Souls game despite being one of the more memorable titles in the series for me. It was later into the following year that I got the 2 DLCs for the game and beat those as well. During that time, I finally got the formula to click with me. I couldn't get enough of Souls at that point. I kept playing and playing, doing reruns of Dark Souls 1 and 3, as well as charging through my first run of Dark Souls 2. After beating Sister Frieda for the first time around February of 2018, I made a promise to myself. I promised myself that I would take on every challenge that Souls had to offer, every boss, every game. So from that moment, I set out to do what every Souls fan tells people to do when they first play the game. I sought out to get good. Before I could get good though, I had to finish out the Souls trilogy. That way I could say that I had beaten all of the Souls games. I started my journey with Dark Souls 2 on Christmas of 2017, this time buying it for myself through a gift card instead of asking for it from my parents. Out of all my first experiences with Souls games, I have the least to say about this one. At this point, the formula had clicked with me, and my general struggles really weren't there anymore. I was getting stuck with some of the ambushes and mechanics, but I don't think I really hit a wall like I did in the other two games. There were moments here and there where I did have issues, but it didn't take me nearly as long to get through them. I did struggle super hard in the Shrine of Amana, but that's basically a given if you've just started Dark Souls 2. Even though I struggled there, I wasn't there for any huge length of time, so I don't count it as a wall. I beat Dark Souls 2 on May 27th of 2018. At this point, I had multiple clears of both Dark Souls and Dark Souls 3 under my belt and would continue to gather more. Dark Souls 2 was a game that I was told to stay away from, and although my playthrough wasn't significant, it did tell me that everyone who told me to avoid it was wrong. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty about Dark Souls 2, because I already did that, but I will say that it is one that I'm glad I didn't delay until later. Playing it third wasn't the worst decision I could have made, but I'm glad I didn't wait until I had played other games in the franchise before touching it. Throughout the following year, not much happened between me and the series. I did monthly reruns of Dark Souls 1 and sometimes picked up the other two games. At some point around the beginning of 2019, I started caring about achievement hunting for the series. I started to chase the Dark Souls 3 achievements, but I gave up after finding out about the Silver Knight farm. After that defeat, I decided to do something much less time-consuming and difficult. I decided to do an all-bosses run of each game. I started with Dark Souls 3 and ended with Dark Souls 2. I didn't truly end with Dark Souls 2 because the version of Dark Souls 1 that I had didn't include the DLC, so I wouldn't actually do that until much later, but I did at least try to do all the series bosses around this time. Nothing too terribly significant happened in my all bosses runs, other than me being absolutely curb-stomped by Midir and Gale. My Dark Souls 2 run, however, was incredibly significant as it was the first time in my Souls career where I began and finished a challenge run. I decided to do a fists-only run through the game for my all bosses run. I followed a video guide by Yimfa and got to work at besting all 42 bosses that Dark Souls 2 had to offer. This run was painful at first. I had no idea how to effectively kill Roy and ended up losing all my souls at one point because I wasn't being patient enough with my movements. Thanks to my inexperience and me doing all bosses, this run ended up being my longest challenge run to date at a whopping 18 hours long from start to finish. 4 of those hours being all in the setup stage. I took my fist with me all the way from the gutter to the Throne of Want, stopping at each boss to ensure that my challenge would be complete. I figured out very early into the run that being at melee range for most of the Dark Souls 2 bosses kinda sucks. Getting over it was hard, and at times I felt compelled to swap briefly to an actual weapon to get over these problems. I never did and ended up triumphant. This run is the only challenge run that I do more often than a regular run. It is also the only challenge run that I have done more than just once. Dark Souls 2 is one of the few games in the FromSoft lineup that I actively avoid some bosses in. It and Bloodborne are the only 2 games that have bosses that I have no desire to try and fight a second time. For one reason or another, I don't care enough to try and fight them again. As I ended that run and became successful at killing nearly every boss in the series, I opened my eyes to the next 2 games in my Souls Horizon. Those games being Sekiro and Jedi Fallen Order. Now, Jedi Fallen Order's story is quick and simple. The game didn't run well on my Xbox. Enemies would T-pose, clip in and out of existence, doors wouldn't open, and sometimes I'd fall through the floor. So I gave up, tried getting a refund, was denied, and that was the end of it. As my first Souls-like game outside of the main trilogy, it was fun for what I could play, but I'm sad that I couldn't play it at all past a certain point. It sits forever on my shelf of games that I bought but can't play for one reason or another. Sekiro is another story, one that is unfortunately similar to Fallen Order. I bought Sekiro on Christmas Day of 2019. I was only able to play and enjoy the first few areas of the game up until Ashina Castle. After that, my Xbox once again decided it was too old and lame to run Sekiro, and things began to break and stop working.
Unlike Fallen Order, my issues here were with controller input delay and not the game not working. My controller inputs all had about a 2-second delay to them. This made it not only difficult to play the game, but at times impossible because when there wasn't a delay, my inputs wouldn't go through at all. The age and lack of care given to my Xbox had finally become apparent. I've since gone back and cleaned my Xbox, but unfortunately the damage done is permanent. This has kept my streak of unfinished runs alive. My first run of Sekiro was never completed and likely will never be completed. From what I was able to play, I did enjoy what Sekiro was able to present for me. It was a new challenge, one that was entirely different to what I had experienced before, demanding skill and high performance to complete. I struggled hard to adapt to Sekiro, but it never clicked for me once during my first run. I spent days at the Burning Bowl just to spend forever on Snake Eyes. And when I say forever, I mean forever, because this is when I hit the delay wall. I never got to the top of Ashina Castle and couldn't beat the Drunken Warrior at the start of Harada Estate. It was a run that was ended by force. Even if it had continued, I wasn't ready to learn the skills necessary to progress. So seeing as my efforts were futile, I stopped Sekiro and set my sights on a game I knew well, and one that I especially could deal with the delay. That game being Dark Souls Remastered. Dark Souls Remastered came out, and like some sort of sucker, I bought it instantly. Say what you want about the game, but it's one of the better ways for new players to experience everything the game has to offer, and everything is exactly why I bought it. The inclusion of the Artorias DLC is what drove me to spend $60 on a game that I already owned. Honestly, after hearing so much about Artorias and Manus, I was preparing myself for one of the hardest Souls challenges I've ever experienced. I don't know why I was expecting that, but I was. Artorias ended up being one of the coolest fights in the DLC. It was a nice palate cleanser after the annoyance that was the Sanctuary Guardian. I didn't have a hard time against Artorias, but I did get trashed on by Manus. It took me probably 20 or 30 tries to kill Manus, but that was nothing compared to Calamite. Calamite took me almost 6 hours straight to kill, not because he was hard, but because I actually forgot to kill him on my first run and had to go into New Game Plus to do it instead. Calamite was rough, but not nearly as rough as Manus. Taking down Calamite, I had finally killed every single boss in the Souls trilogy, but I wasn't done. There were still 3 games I hadn't finished. 1 because of unfortunate circumstances, and 2 that I didn't own the consoles for. So, seeing as I couldn't really continue from where I was at the time, I decided to continue playing the games I could, waiting for the day where I could finish Sekiro and play the other games in the lineup. It was around this time that I decided to start doing other challenge runs for Dark Souls Remastered. I did what must have been around 10 different runs, and out of those 10, I only beat 2. One of them was a deathless run of the game, and the other was Soul Level 1. The more I played the game, the more I fell in love with it. Dark Souls slowly became my favorite Souls game, one that I would choose over the others at any junction. I would beat the game multiple times a month, sometimes multiple times a day. It got to a point where I was completely obsessed with the game. During this time, I got all of the achievements and beat each boss multiple times. To this day, it is the only Souls game I have played with multiple kills on all of the bosses in the game. Dark Souls is incredibly special to me, and I would like to thank this period of time for that. Over the course of 2020, I would eventually stop playing Dark Souls as much. I picked up the other games again and played through them a few times before the end of 2020. It was on Christmas of 2020 that I would get my PC and make 3 purchases. Those, of course, being Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3 again, but on Steam this time. As 2020 turned into 2021, I began to play other games and would put the series down for a while. During this time, I played several different games and would occasionally go back to play Dark Souls with mods installed. But one thing was on my mind, and on the minds of thousands of Soul fans. That was the upcoming game by FromSoft, revealed during E3 of 2019, nearly 2 years prior. That game being Elden Ring. Before Elden Ring could come out though, I had 2 more games to play. At the time, I had money and luck on my side. So in November of 2021, while off my gourd on a lack of sleep while sitting in an auto shop, I bought a PS5. Not a scalped one either, an honest and true PS5 for $550. When it arrived, I picked it up, bought Demon's Souls and Bloodborne, and played Astro's Playroom for 5 hours. This is not a joke. I actually played Astro's Playroom for 5 hours on the first day I had the PS5. The next day though, I actually started playing both Demon's Souls and Bloodborne. I played Demon's Souls up until I killed the Phalanx on day 1. Nothing too significant to say about it honestly. I felt like I was back in the trenches in Dark Souls. It reminded me of how it felt to be new at one of these games, which was a welcome change honestly. Bloodborne, however, completely consumed me when I played it. I finished the day having killed the cleric beast and setting my sights on Father Gascoigne. Just a month later, on the day right after Christmas, I beat the game, making it the fastest game I beat from start to finish. Well, at least for now. Bloodborne was amazing. I'm not one of the people who will sit and endlessly praise it, but it was really good. It's a shame that it's console exclusive, keeping such a great game away from poor people. Bloodborne was the first of these games to snatch my attention completely. It was the first one I couldn't avoid thinking about, playing a little bit every day I could. I found myself slaying nightmare after nightmare, beast after beast, working my way up to fight Gehrman, and above all else, fight the Orphan of Kos. I expected nothing but the best from these bosses. Having fought every boss in the Souls games, I was ready for the challenge. A challenge that I never found, at least not in the way I expected to. At this point, I had become attuned to the laws of not only the Souls games, but this game as well. I blew through every boss in my way up until I beat the game, Father Gascoigne being the only boss to kill me more than 6 times, Abredis being the second most deaths, and Ludwig being the third. Abredis only killed me so many times because when I got to her, I had a +6 weapon and was completely underleveled. My stubbornness was my downfall here, but it was the only time I had that issue. Ludwig is probably one of my favorite bosses from Bloodborne, and yes, it is because of the Moonlight Greatsword. His fight was brutal and challenging, being one of the best fights to test your abilities against the beasts of the Hunter's Nightmare. Going forward towards the end of the DLC is where one of my favorite fights of all time is. Lady Maria is one of the most memorable fights I've done in the series and was one that I was hyped for, having heard of her difficulty for years prior to my run. I wasn't disappointed. She never got the better of me, but she did whittle me down. By the end of the fight, I was left with 1 blood vial and killed her only because God allowed me to. Even with that, I don't think I would have died a second time if I had died there. Her fight taught me and tested me. I learned how to better time my attacks and parries. I was tested on my ability to fight against another hunter. Her fight is by and large one of my favorites from the FromSoft franchise, and the following fight is just as good, if not better. I am not going to sugarcoat it, I only died to Orphan twice. Having heard that Orphan is the hardest boss in the whole franchise at the time, I was expecting exactly what I got, but I was too well adjusted to it. I fought Orphan the same day that I killed Ludwig and Maria. I pretty much binged the entirety of the Old Hunters DLC in one day. I don't think he isn't hard, and I'm not trying to make myself out to be a god gamer here. Orphan is most attuned to those who have mastered every bit of what the game gives you. I like to think of it as Bloodborne's Swordstein Ishin, even though those two bosses are nothing alike. Orphan is my favorite fight from Bloodborne. It throws so much hatred and rage at you, hyperbolizing nothing. Everything that it hates is justified. You are the only hunter capable of facing it, killing it, and freeing everyone from the nightmare. The Orphan of Kos is the reminder of the sins of everyone who built up what you experience in the game. It is the embodiment of the challenges the game has faced you with. It is one of the first bosses in the series to really get this message through to its players. Gwen was okay enough, and Nashandra was embarrassing. Not even the DLC bosses were anywhere near this level of crazy. Dark Souls 3 would come in exactly a year later to do it all again, but right this time. I'm glad these games have grown to test the player on everything they've learned throughout the game, being true testaments to the game's challenges and your built-up power. The best example of this being done throughout the game is Sekiro in my opinion, but that will be discussed later. For now, I would go on to do hardly anything for the next 10 months. What I mean by hardly anything is I went back to college for a semester, lost all my free time because I also had work, and played a bunch of other games listed on screen probably. At the end of October 2022, I had just barely wrapped up writing and editing one of my first YouTube videos, this one about Resident Evil Reverse. After achieving minor success with that video, I quickly made another one about degeneration and then stopped for a minute. During that minute, I picked up Demon's Souls again and finished it this time. The game itself is good. It's a nice beginning to what would eventually become one of the most famous franchises in gaming history. I don't have much to say about the game, unfortunately. The game had its moments here and there, but overall was just a quick and fun game. It is by far the most annoying to 100% though. Despite my lack of interest in the game, I still enjoyed my playthrough. I beat it a couple of weeks after picking it back up, and I will definitely play it again at some point. But for now, it's got a nice spot on my shelf as I play other games. Now, if you've been paying attention to the timeline, you would have noticed that I completely skipped over Elden Ring. And yes, I did. I was gonna say that I wanted to have more consistency in breaking up this video into parts, but I'll be honest, I wrote the whole timeline and only at the very, very end did I realize that I completely forgot to add Elden Ring. Then when I did add it in, I put it in the wrong place. So let's do a little backing up for a minute here to talk about Elden Ring, a game that truly won over the world. When everyone else was hyping themselves up for Elden Ring, I was silently waiting for it. I really didn't think about it and only really got excited about it a week before it came out. I'm the kind of person to be hopeful about the success of something I like, but won't call it until I see it for myself. This has worked out in my favor a few times. For instance, when I first heard Anthem was supposed to be a Destiny killer, I decided to avoid it like the plague, and I was correct because that game sucked. For Elden Ring, this made my experience and overall enjoyment feel more authentic. I hadn't decided the quality of the game before playing it, so I couldn't be super disappointed, but I could be overwhelmed with excitement. Elden Ring to date holds my quickest start to finish time in the entire series, starting my run on launch day, that day being February 25th, and ending it on March 12th, getting the 100% achievement just 2 days later. I did skip a lot of quests, but those were just about all I skipped. My time being consumed by bosses, making builds, exploring new areas, fighting in dungeons, and in general beating the game. On one of those 15 days, I even played for 14 hours straight, beating my previous time of longest single game session, which was only 7 hours, that title belonging to Super Mario Galaxy 2. Elden Ring for those 2 weeks completely took over my life. I still went to work, but when I wasn't at work, I was on Elden Ring. I won't go into Elden Ring the same way that I went into the other games. This game wasn't like any of the other games, making it special in the context of my history with the series, and special in the context of this video. So the bulk of what would be here will be later on in the video. My first playthrough can be summarized as a katana bleed spam and holy magic. I struggled where many others did and overcame all the challenges the game threw at me. I finished killing every boss a week after I finished getting the 100% achievement. My playthrough wasn't too terribly special, but my experience was, and I will get into that a bit later. For now, I want to briefly discuss one main part of my playthrough. That part is the Godskin duo. Elden Ring has so many bosses that are really good. For an open world game, this is even more significant, but the Godskin duo was such a massive disappointment. They are the worst boss in the entire game. It's 2 cool bosses being shoved together just because, and the worst part is that it happens twice. The worst boss, which is 2 reused bosses, is reused in a dungeon, and the dungeon version still makes more sense as a boss. This boss is successfully the first boss in the entire franchise past Dark Souls to be 100% negative in my mind. The only other boss in all 7 of the Soulsborne series that I hate this much is the Bed of Chaos. There is nothing positive I can say about this boss, and it is an absolute shame they show up during what would be otherwise one of the best endgames in the entirety of the series. That's all I have to say about Elden Ring for the moment. For now, let's get back to where we were with the timeline. It's time to really talk about Sekiro. Now, if it weren't for my first Sekiro run having never been finished, then Sekiro would have beaten Elden Ring's clear time by 2 whole days, finishing in 13 days instead of 15, the 100% being even faster at 14 days instead of 17. This game consumed me far more than Elden Ring did. Instead of spending 14 hours in one day playing the game, I played the game for 4 hours, 9 days in a row. This isn't how my time was broken up really, but I do know I was playing it for several days in a row for well over an hour each day. I was obsessed with Sekiro, and it was all because of one thing during one boss. I was starting to get into the game and the swing of things as I was getting past the bosses of Harada Estate. Getting to Lady Butterfly, I began to struggle like I did when my Xbox was beginning to have delayed inputs. I died a few times, getting just a little bit farther each time, then it all fell into place. I went in and took her out as if I'd played the game for months already. I went on to breeze the game, excelling where I was once struggling. I didn't just melt my way through the game, I did hit a few walls here and there. They didn't last long, but I did spend some time throwing myself at a few bosses over and over again. I never really took any breaks, so I was able to surpass these walls quickly. The way the entire game flowed and felt in my hands was amazing. It felt fluid and rewarding. My favorite bosses being the ones that stopped me and made me feel like I was being tested. The best of all of these bosses being Sword Saint Ishin. Ishin, in my opinion, is the best final boss the series has ever seen. Ishin truly tests you on everything you have ever learned in the game. It is his fight more than any other that reminds you not to trust anything. Both owl bosses are a close second, but I feel that example is more akin to lies rather than misdirection. If it weren't for my extreme bias towards Dark Souls 1, then Sekiro would be my favorite game out of all the FromSoft titles. It is combat perfected with the best bosses and gameplay out of all of the 7 games. This is a big thing to say, I know, but honestly, if there is any reason to say that Sekiro doesn't fit in with the other games, then it's the gameplay. This game doesn't play at all like the other games, and only somewhat borrows from them. Sekiro's unique spot in this timeline of games makes it easy to include, but difficult to avoid. If you're a fan of the Souls games and have played outside of the original trilogy, then you've probably tried Sekiro. This is why I personally include it with the Souls-likes, even if it doesn't make sense at times. I've said most of what I want to say, but like Elden Ring, I'll add onto this in a later segment. Sekiro is incredibly special to me, and I hope to see more games like it in the future. As 2022 turned to 2023, my time with Souls would slow down the most it ever has before. I decided during the last half of 2022 that I was going to once again try and diversify my gaming experiences, so I set out to play everything in my Steam library, as well as everything I have on PS5. I'm still far from done with that, but at least I'm making consistent progress. The biggest thing in the way of this is the persistence of my other hobbies and work, one of those hobbies being my venture into making content on YouTube. This being one of the biggest reasons I slowed down doing pretty much anything in my day-to-day life actually. Unlike my other hobbies, I can actually combine my time with Souls with my foray into content creation. This would first occur late into 2022 when I mentioned Dark Souls in my second video about music and gaming. The first real mentioning would be on the 1st of January 2023 during my third video on music. This wouldn't be my first video to get some amount of views, but it was the biggest at the time. This drove me to rush my fourth and final video on music and start working on a video about Elden Ring. I won't say anything about this video other than it needed far more work before it could be what I wanted it to be. The same can be said for my video on Dark Souls 2, that video being a better video overall, but still could have used a little more time in the oven. Other than this video, I made 5 shorts about the Souls series and Sekiro, this current video being the next Souls video added to that shelf. Other than making content about Souls, in 2023 I decided to do a few challenge runs that I hadn't tried out before. Among those is one that is still ongoing and may beat my Dark Souls 2 run for length. This run is a torch-only run of Elden Ring. Hey, what's up guys, it is Editing Rat here. I just wanted to say that while I was writing the script everything was fine, but when I went to roll back my saves on Elden Ring to record footage for this video, I accidentally wiped the entire torch-only save, so RIP to that. I'll probably restart that one at some point later this year. But otherwise, my feelings are extremely hurt, and I'm not doing too well. This challenge run has been one of my favorites that I've done for the series. I've learned so much about the game's bosses and mechanics that I otherwise would have just glossed over, turning the game's difficulty up by removing consistent damage and forcing myself to play slower. Taking away summons and status effects put the game into a new perspective for me. I encourage anyone who is thinking about doing a torch-only run to try it out. There are some pretty rough spots here and there, but overall, the run is pretty great if you're looking for a challenge. And that brings us to the present. I know that was a lot of talking for what was essentially just a slight retelling of my experience with the series. I decided to do it this way so that I could effectively break up the video into parts. One large timeline and another large section with the actual meat and potatoes of the video. So now that I've told you all about my journey, let me tell you my story. My story begins all the way back at the very, very beginning of the timeline, before I even heard about Dark Souls. When I was younger, I played a few games here and there, with limited variety due to several reasons. I played Minecraft the most around that time and some Nintendo games here and there, but I didn't have anything except Nintendo and mobile, so I stuck with what I had. Because of this, and my tendency to pick up things that were easy to grasp and learn, I didn't get the opportunity to branch out, and as such, fell into a state of stagnation where I only played what I was familiar with. When I got my Xbox, that somewhat changed. Avenues not previously open to me became open. I was able to try things out that I had never been able to before. Of course, my kid brain just wanted to shoot guns in games, so once again I fell into a pattern of playing what I knew. The only game to somewhat break this cycle was Destiny, but the only reason I say that is because it had raids and such, which were much more difficult than anything I had done previously. Other than that, I just cycled the same few games every week. Played a little bit of one, then the other, so on and so forth, never really once thinking about the next big game other than the ones I wanted to play before, but couldn't get. Then the day came where I first was told about Dark Souls and given a copy to play. That changed everything for me. After beating Dark Souls, even with my general lack of initial interest, I wanted to play something like it again. I wanted to diversify my game library, playing everything I could. I didn't get the opportunity to until much later, but I did actively want to bring actual variety to what I did play. As time went on, and as I played more of the Souls series, I became more and more enthusiastic about trying new things. I have always been the kind of person who craves variety, but never had the motivation to do so. Now, thanks to some help from Dark Souls, I have that motivation. Last year I played 52 games on Steam, 26 of those being new ones that I had never played before. That doesn't include games I played on PS5, Oculus, or Switch. I find time to play these games and enjoy the experiences I have with them. As of late, I've been starting to completely leave the games that were largely holding me back. I have begun to try out new things, and I have discovered a lot about what I like and who I am as a result. I don't want to say it's all thanks to Dark Souls, but I know that Dark Souls did some of the heavy lifting, so I have to thank it for that. The series opened up my eyes to so many new horizons. I now openly welcome challenges whenever and wherever I can. So thank you, Dark Souls. Thank you for teaching me to not let even the toughest of challenges stop me from pursuing what I want. Thank you for teaching me that I can overcome anything that is thrown at me. Thank you to Miyazaki and to the whole FromSoft dev team working on these games. It is because of your hard work that I have learned to work hard at what I do. So remember all those times in the timeline where I said I'd get to it later? Welcome to later. This segment of the video is entirely comprised of my thoughts and feelings about all 7 games in the franchise. Every single one, in as much detail as I care to divulge. Some games will be fairly short, and other games will be long. If you want to skip to any specific game, then there are timestamp chapters in the description you can skip to, or you can just click on the progress bar to get there, whichever floats your boat. For now, let's start with the beginning of the series, Demon's Souls. Demon's Souls is a strange place to start considering I only beat it last year. I definitely have the least to say about it as well, considering it's the only Souls game that I haven't beaten twice. I'll start off with a basic statement about my overall feelings about the game. I like Demon's Souls. It's a nice little foray into the Souls formula, and I see it as a fitting start to the franchise. It is definitely one of, if not the easiest game out of the 7. A lot of that has to do with the simple progression system in place in the game, as well as the game's overall length. Demon's Souls is not a long game, and that is perfectly okay. It has a sort of charm in being simplistic, separating all of its areas into the Archstones, connected only by the Nexus. These areas all being broken up between 3 bosses, 2 follow-up bosses and the main ending boss. It's a formula that never gets thrown out for the entirety of the game. The only time this kind of happens is in Boletaria after the Penetrator fight, giving the area 1 additional level and 1 additional boss. The exception here is that this is the final boss of the entire game, so it makes sense. My experience with the game was quite basic. I went in with a rapier build that allowed me to Dark Souls chew my way through the game after I spent hours farming for Sharpstone. The rarity of some drop items and basic upgrade materials is kind of ridiculous, but I can excuse this because overall, it's fairly minimal. Unless you're going for an extremely specific build, then you won't need to farm for more difficult stones. Demon's Souls areas are made with a lot of care in mind. At times, the areas can feel poorly made, but for most of the game, this is not the case. I like Boletaria's medieval fantasy setting, dragons flying around the landscape, burning the ruins of the city to the ground, knights fighting a horde of monsters, guarding their king. I like the smithing ground's progression from being a mine to being a huge hidden temple, locking away the dragon god. I love the horror that is embedded into every inch of Latria. The dark pathways through the tower leading downwards into a wide open area populated by gargoyles and horrific flesh monsters. Every area has its touches. Whether those are good or not is up to the player. Each area is at least decent. That's all I can really say about them. They are pretty linear in their progression and look amazing. Nothing too special, nothing too terrible. The weapons in this game are where the variety of Demon's Souls takes its roots. This is one of the few Souls games where the starting gear is more often than not more desirable than some of the more special weapons available. It is also one of the few games where magic is viable for a build alongside a full standard weapon build. I like this because I didn't feel limited by my decision to use magic. I put a few levels into intelligence and was able to use most of the basic spells in the game, which were not bad at all. Overall, Demon's Souls is a good game. I didn't find it to be super remarkable, but it was enjoyable. If you have a PS5 or even a PS3 for that matter, then I do suggest picking the game up to try out. As was mentioned before, Dark Souls was my first Souls game. As such, it holds a spot as my favorite Souls title. Even with this, I'm not one of the people who ignores the game's faults. Because of this, I will either spend a lot of time on this game, or a fairly small amount of time on it. I'll leave a note on screen if it ends up being long or not. Dark Souls is what I consider the true start of the series to be. Demon's Souls made the fabric for the Souls formula, and the trilogy wove the tapestry. Dark Souls making the first few moves and attempting to perfect that formula. Dark Souls takes after its predecessor by keeping the slower pace of gameplay intact, playing more refined, albeit a bit less fluid. At least that's how I perceive it to be. There is a lot of clunk to the first Souls game, and while it is endearing to me, it might not be the same for others. Especially players who first started with Dark Souls 3 or Elden Ring. It tends to be easier to speed up than to slow down, which for action gamers is a very true statement. The pace of Dark Souls gameplay isn't out of place. It fits right alongside the world of Lordran, taking on enemies one at a time in a way that feels more robotic, but fair. The game's variety of weapons allowing you to choose how you want to tackle each fight, although most players will go for the up-close and personal approach with strength or slashing weapons. Dark Souls takes a massive step up from Demon Souls in the weapons department. This is honestly the most consistent improvement the series has. Weapon variety practically doubles in each game with limited exceptions. Dark Souls weapons feel consistent in what they can do, but some of these starting weapons like the axe and broadsword don't improve much over time. You can take any of the weapons with you to go in, but there are better options available for you to use. My go-to weapons are the halberd and the golden tracer. The halberd is a good weapon in general, and the tracer has a cool effect when you swing it. Nothing much to say there. They both do damage, and I can beat the game with them, which is all I really care about besides overall fun factor. Dark Souls' areas are something that I really don't have much to talk about. Each area has its ups and downs. Some are mostly downs, but I do appreciate at least one thing about each of them. I do really like the look of Lost Izalith, but I like it as much as I like other places like the Kiln of the First Flame or Undeadburg. Undeadburg is probably my favorite starting area though. It feels lived in and there's a sense that it exists outside of your interactions with it. It has a great ruined kingdom feel to it that I love. The biggest thing that stuck out to me about this game when I first played it were the game's bosses. The boss lineup in Dark Souls is one that I feel is good, but overall is just alright. This will come as a shocker to a lot of people, but I don't actually hold Dark Souls bosses in very high regard. They each bring something to the table, but their flair dies out after you've played any of the other games. Even with that said, I do like Dark Souls bosses. My top 3 bosses in the game are the main 3 from the DLC, those being Calamite, Artorias, and Manus. In my opinion, those bosses boast the best fights that the game has to offer. There are not many bosses in the base game that I really consider to be the pinnacle of what the game can present for you in terms of a fight. It can be argued that Ornstein and Smough is a boss that really does show the pinnacle of the fights in Dark Souls, but in my opinion, ONS is a fight that I feel is really overrated, only somewhat showing off what the game is capable of with its bosses. Now I want to make a point that I do like the fight. I believe it to be the most iconic boss fight in the game. I just don't believe it's the best fight in the game or believe it to be among my favorites. On that note, the game does have one major flaw with it, that flaw being that it clearly remains unfinished. This is, once again, in my opinion, the worst con the game has. The second half of the game has some stellar bosses, but less stellar areas. Some of those areas being brutally punishing when they don't have to be, or just straight up unfair in their execution. The only time I feel any area is unfair is the entrance to the Nito's boss arena. This fall is the biggest gamble a new player can take, knowing full well that if you took damage leading up to the fog wall, then you're taking even more falling down into the arena. You don't have much time to heal because either the skeletons in the arena will swarm you, or Nito will open up the fight with his Phantom Blade instantly. With experience, this isn't bad at all. As a new player though, or if you're doing a challenge run, then it can be extremely punishing and just unfair. Bosses with this kind of entrance in future games don't damage you during the fall. This is something that I wish was implemented here, but I'll take what we got, even if what we got was annoying. Lost Izalith, Tomb of the Giants, and New Londo Ruins all feel like they lack something. They're all short and feel somewhat rushed or just straight up unfinished. The Demon Ruins and Lost Izalith are commonly referred to as the worst of this, which I agree with wholeheartedly. These areas have enemies just for the sake of having enemies, and Izalith features arguably the worst boss in the entire series. I just don't feel like they have any polish apart from the visual design of the area. The Demon Ruins being the only area in the game where you fight a reskin of a boss you fought already. I mean to say this is an actual boss. You do find more Moonlight Butterflies later on, but they aren't bosses. Same with the Taurus and Capra demons. Also, the Stray Demon doesn't count because it's practically in the same arena and makes sense to be there. This one flaw is what holds Dark Souls down for a lot of players, and it is what would hold it down for me if I wasn't so prone to Stockholm Syndrome. Dark Souls, even with its flaws, is a great start to the series, and is in my opinion the easiest of the 3 games to beat. It might not be the friendliest to new players or have the best bosses, but it is a fitting start to what would eventually become one of the most iconic game series of all time. I'm glad to have spent my time with this game. It will forever hold a spot in my heart as one of the most life-changing games I've ever played. Now, I have made a video on Dark Souls 2 already that discusses some of my feelings about the game. I want to say that right now, while I stand by most of what I said in that video, I didn't really get into my actual feelings about the game itself. That was more so just a video I made for the sake of talking about Dark Souls 2. so expect this to be a bit different and not nearly as long. At the beginning of my Dark Souls 2 video, I mentioned that I liked Dark Souls 2. That statement is correct. I do like Dark Souls 2 and believe it to be a quality game. Now, even with that being said, I do have it in the bottom 3 on my tier list. Dark Souls 2 has been an enjoyable experience for me. Like I also mentioned in my other video, it gets a lot more flack than it deserves at times. The game is a bit rough around the edges, but it does improve upon the gameplay built up by Dark Souls. The game has its own unique touches, and while many are confined to the game, some did make their way out into the Souls world. My favorite of these to this day is the bonfire aesthetic. I've done that mechanic to death by this point, so I'll just talk about its greater half, which is New Game Plus. Dark Souls 2's take on New Game Plus is honestly the best out of any of the other games. Changing some enemy placements and adding some items here and there. It isn't much, but it at least tries to change the way the game plays. This gives you more of a reason to play New Game Plus over starting another New Game. The aesthetics allowing you to permanently make an entire area harder even past New Game. New Game Plus is one of the weakest parts of these games, and it is only in this game that you are encouraged to try it. Dark Souls 3 does add some things, but those only really matter if you're trying to get the 100% achievements. Like the previous series entry, Dark Souls 2 brings more weapons to the table for the player to use. In fact, according to the 2 minutes of searching I did online, Dark Souls 2 after DLC appears to have the most weapons out of the 3 Souls games. Unfortunately, a lot of these weapons are quite forgettable, but some are underrated gems. I have not tried out many of these weapons, so I don't have much to say about them, but the game does give you a lot of stuff to use, and in my opinion, is the fairest to you in balancing those weapons for standard gameplay. Out of the 42 bosses in the game with DLC, there are a few that actually stand out to me. With so many bosses, there are many stinkers, and a few good hits. But the main takeaway I want people to have from Dark Souls 2's bosses is their variety and design. There are very few repeat bosses in the game, and most have incredible designs to them. There are so many unique fights in the game that stand out just because of the way they look or the way they're presented. The Demon of Song is one that always stands out to me because of how it looks. It's a frog-looking monster with a ghoul face hidden underneath its impervious skin. It looks nothing like I've ever seen in a Souls game. There are similar things to it, but nothing quite like the Demon of Song. I enjoyed the game's general progression as well as the areas that you explore throughout the game. It has a great story, and the DLC tie-ins all add to that story in such wonderful ways. I honestly don't have much more to say about Dark Souls 2. It's a fun game, but is generally unremarkable. For all the things I praise it for, it does have an equal amount of downsides. I'm not as big a fan of the game's enemy placement. At times it feels like some enemies are too clustered, and at other times it feels like they aren't clustered enough. I'm not a fan of all the Hyde Tower Knights being placed in the Tower of Flame in Scholar Edition. It's the one game out of the 3 where I actually hate its poison area. The gutter has a cool aesthetic to it, but the Black Gulch is just a nightmare of an area. It looks cool because of the color palette, but otherwise it just sucks. Some places feel pointless to explore either because they are too small or because they don't have anything good to grab in them. Some bosses, despite looking and being cool, just aren't fun to fight, either being too annoying or too easy to want to care about them. Those, among other things, are what bring this game down for me. Other than that, I don't have anything else to say about the game. If you watched to this point and want to hear me talk about the game some more, then check out my video on Dark Souls 2. Bloodborne is one of the games of all time. In all honesty, it's pretty good and among my favorites in the Soulsborne franchise. What made it special for me was how well it stood out from the Souls games, especially for the time it came out, being released a year after Dark Souls 2. It felt like a much better jump forward for FromSoft. Bloodborne, at least to me, feels like a spiritual successor to Dark Souls 3 based on how it plays. It feels like it took Dark Souls 3 gameplay and perfected it to a point, which is ridiculous to say because Dark Souls 3 came out a whole year after Bloodborne did. This isn't to say that Dark Souls 3 is a step backwards for FromSoft, it's more so an example of the differences that these two games have. For what Bloodborne is, its gameplay is perfect. The same goes for Dark Souls 3, but if they were to swap their styles, then things wouldn't quite be right. As is pretty obvious by this point, my favorite thing about Bloodborne is the gameplay. This is what held my attention throughout my 40 hours with the game. I don't have a lot of time sunk into this game. I want to play it more, but with other games in my lineup, it'll just have to take a rest for now. I'm glad that this video gave me an excuse to play it again because the way it plays is just amazing. The fluid, quick-paced, and varied combat is what keeps this game going for me. I love games that keep you on your feet, Armored Core being the series that gave me this love for rapid, metamorphic combat. Trying new things at every turn and fighting to the last breath over and over again to perfect your skills. Bloodborne serves this gameplay up in droves, so long as you experiment with what the game gives you. I am overhyping the gameplay a bit here, but to me, this is what it feels like. It's such a well-paced game with so much more to explore and uncover. I love the dark atmospheres and environments the game presents you with, even down to the drab and dusty Chalice dungeons, which aren't too impressive visually. The things that add the most to the wonderful combat of Bloodborne are the game's weapons. In total, Bloodborne has 26 weapons. This is a far cry from the Souls games where there are well over 100 weapons in each game. Without DLC, the number is even smaller at 15. This is only including trick weapons and not firearms. Right-handed trick weapons are part of why I love the game's combat so much. While attacking with these weapons, you can hit the left bumper to transform the weapon, doing a transformation attack. Each transformation of a weapon has a differing moveset, some becoming heavier, others becoming lighter. If you attack and transform though, you do an additional attack that not only improves your attack variety, but it can also hit a lot harder than other attacks, placing more encouragement in the player's way for trying out new attack patterns and shaking up the weapons they use. Your firearm layers on an additional avenue for creating openings for some devastating attacks. If timed right, your firearm shots will stun or parry an enemy. This opens them up for a visceral. Learning all the timings for these attacks was an outstanding experience for me. It felt so rewarding to practice on a boss for what felt like hours getting these timings right. If you can get these attacks down often, then you can practically melt through a boss's health bar, ending the fight in what feels like seconds. If you're feeling a little ballsy, then you can create a build where your firearm does your main damage. It's a bit tough to set up, but it looks like tons of fun as a challenge run. The last thing I want to say about the game's combat is that while magic is an available option, it's not really a great one. I like the options you get for magic, all of them look pretty cool. They use up bullets at a pretty high rate and don't hit as hard as I'd like them to. I never personally found them to be very viable, but I did enjoy having them as an option to use. Bloodborne is a very short game. In New Game Plus, it can be beaten in just over an hour if you know exactly where to go and don't die to any bosses along the way. For how short it is, and arguably how linear it is, Bloodborne provides a consistently fun experience from start to finish. The Old Hunters DLC adds a lot to the game in terms of longevity and fun. The true endgame of Bloodborne are the dungeons, but the DLC is something I recommend everyone try out first. It is my favorite Soulsborne DLC so far. It has my two favorite bosses from the game as well as my favorite area in all of Soulsborne, that area being the fishing hamlet. It is a grotesque monument to the sins of the villagers and the failures of the healing church, kept in constant suffering, guarded by Lady Maria and ending with the Orphan of Kos. All of this made for an experience that made me so glad to have bought my PS5 and spent time with this game. While it isn't my favorite game in the franchise, it is one of my favorite action RPGs to this day. If it weren't for another game in the FromSoft lineup, then it would hold a strong second place on my tier list, but that will come later. For now, let's talk about the third and final game in the Souls trilogy. As you probably saw earlier when I flashed my tier list on screen, this game is my second favorite of the main trilogy games. This is because of a combination of two things, linearity and its reliance on the first game to carry its story. The second thing is kind of a nitpick. What this game does borrow and use from the first game isn't too offensive. I just wish that it used its own world more to tell its tale at times, giving us more depth to locations like the Profaned Capital or the Archdragon's Peak. The only location tie-in that I didn't like was Firelink Shrine being used again as the main hub. The hub itself is fine, I just wish it wasn't called Firelink Shrine, instead being its own main thing. Again, this is a personal preference and not me saying the game is F tier because of it. As for the linearity part, this game is very linear. You move in a straight line for the vast majority of the game, only splitting up occasionally on fringe paths before reconnecting back to the main one. This limits what you can do as you are forced to make your way through an area before getting to the next one. I know this sounds like the classic, world connectivity that all Dark Souls 1 fanboys preach, but that's not what I care about here. I would have liked for there to have been more depth in these paths, more puzzle-type things like the Fair and Swamp candles instead of standard progression paths, giving players more of a reason to explore and see the areas presented to them, making areas larger and giving them more depth, expanding locations like the Grand Archives or the Catacombs, allowing them to feel larger and more significant. Not to say that they aren't already significant, but many areas in this game just feel small. Once you've ran the game once, you know where to go, and there is less reason to go exploring unless you need something in that space. I guess my complaints is less about the game's linearity and is more about the game's size. Either way, it could benefit from being longer and larger, but for what it is perfectly okay. This game brings even more weapons to the table, and unlike Dark Souls 2, these ones are actually cool. Dark Souls 3's weapon variety is insane and is what I like to call true variety. I feel actively encouraged to try out everything in this game, and options are made known to you throughout your experience. During my first playthrough, I was a quality build up until I found the Fume Greatsword. Not long after I got to 50 strength, I discovered all the spells I could be using. From there I built into magic and used that for range alongside my big swords. In subsequent runs, I tried out everything. Each weapon and spell I tried made me fall more in love with the variety the game offers. I would say this is Dark Souls 3's greatest strength. The only things on par with the weapons in Dark Souls 3 are the bosses. Now, everyone who has played Dark Souls 3 has said that the bosses are the highlight of the game, and I agree with that to a point. The game has amazing bosses, and with the improved combat gameplay, these bosses shine brightly. The faster pace of play allows the bosses to be a bit more aggressive while also allowing you to play aggressively depending on your build. Like the linearity issue, the thing I don't like as much about the bosses is how few of them there are. This is a tiny little nitpick though, as I do believe the bosses in this game to be the best out of the whole trilogy and second to Sekiro's bosses. In my opinion, Dark Souls 3's bosses are the pinnacle of the Souls boss experience. Each are well tailored to the gameplay and allow for decent experimentation without punishing you too much for trying new things. This is a comment that will come back later. The endgame felt consistent and featured some pretty memorable bosses. The quest lines, while touchy and easy to mess up, each provide more insight to the world and its people. Dark Souls 3 does all of this exceptionally well. Even though I'm not as big a fan of the game, the experience is what keeps me coming back to it. I love to make new builds, I love fighting these bosses over and over again, I love the challenge, and I love overcoming it. That is what I love most about Dark Souls 3. Its ties to the first game also helped me to appreciate the first game even more, knowing the fate that would await it and the importance of your actions in that game. What makes it middle of my list is seriously just personal preference. I'd like a longer game with a couple more bosses, better branching paths, and a bigger focus on shaking up the combat so not everything is as aggressive. That, and again, I just feel like games like Bloodborne do the combat better, and Sekiro has a better way of doing bosses. Though if it were just the main trilogy games, then Dark Souls 3 would be the best of them by far. It is the most polished and most focused of the three games, and little holds it back. I might not like it as much as the others, but it is still a wonderful experience. I believe that this game is a good spot to start if you're new to the series, but I'd still recommend starting from the beginning so you can get the full appreciation for how well Dark Souls 3 improved the formula. Sekiro Shadows Die Twice was my favorite gaming experience of the last year. What stuck out to me the most about Sekiro was the combat, and by that I mean everything about the gameplay in general. Sekiro is the most fluid sword combat game that I've ever played, though I don't want to make that seem like I believe it to be the best, because I've played relatively few sword combat games. This was the first game I've played where your sword literally clashes with your enemy's sword. A lot of that comes from the ringing sound you get while parrying. The rest comes from the sparks that fly from the two swords. I've played other games that are somewhat like this, but those games don't have the same feel to them, the combat feeling either robotic or lacking fluid motion. I say this, but it is very possible that I'm just washed up in bias here. But washed up in bias I will remain because Sekiro still has amazing combat regardless. Sekiro's gameplay is very fast-paced, and because of that, you need to adapt to the speed in order to then adapt to the way enemies function. Learning attacks and how to counter them is key to success in Sekiro, as the game will not let up at any moment past its first couple hours. Skills are also a very prominent part of the game, and each come into play in the moment-to-moment gameplay, some allowing for advanced stealth and others giving you more options to break up enemies. The combat-based skills allow for different styles of play depending on what kind of combos you want to do, each being a viable way to tackle Sekiro's challenges. The bosses of Sekiro are, in my opinion, the best out of any of FromSoft's Soul games. This is somewhat unfair to say as Sekiro functions on a completely different level than the other games. Sekiro's bosses are tightly knit together with the base gameplay. You can't really brute force your way through them. I'm sure it's possible, but it would be far more difficult than just learning the bosses and beating them normally. Each boss is a test of what you've learned up to that point. This includes gimmick fights like the Divine Dragon, which tests you on your skills while countering lightning. Many of the bosses and even some mini-bosses are incredibly memorable, either because of their boastful or cocky nature or because of how grand the scale of their fight is. The most memorable fights for me were Lady Butterfly, Owl the Father, and Sword Saint Ishin. Ishin's significance is fairly obvious and is my favorite fight in the game. The fight is set in 2 stages, with the second having 3 phases, the fight changing in massive ways with each phase. This fight tests you on everything you have ever learned and rarely tries to deceive you. You need all of your skills in reaction timing, countering, parrying, and creating distance. It is a final exam of a fight that never lets up and ends in such a satisfying way. I love this fight, and it will take a lot to surpass this fight as my favorite boss of all time. Owl the Father's memorability comes primarily from the deception he uses during the fight. Shinobi versus Shinobi. This fight tests you on yourself. Like in his other fight, Owl will deceive you and use your own tools against you, even using your Makiri counter against you if you decide to use a thrust attack against him. This fight is incredibly challenging but also fun. If you find yourself in the situation to fight this boss, then I strongly suggest doing so. I was able to get a lot of this footage thanks to one of my favorite parts of this game, that being the memory system. The memory system works in 2 parts. Using memories gives you more attack power and stores the boss where the memory came from in the sculptor's idols. This allows you to access any boss fight in the game and replay it. Replaying bosses outside of New Game Plus is something I've wanted in the Souls series for a long time now. Sekiro is the perfect place to have it appear first. Another aspect of the game that I love is the gauntlet system. Added into the game later on, the gauntlets are something that I've only seen in the Souls series through modding. These gauntlets are curated boss rushes where failure at any point means repeating the full gauntlet. Finishing one of these gauntlets gives you one of the game's few cosmetics. I miss rewards like this for finishing challenges in games. It's nice to have this in Sekiro as it gives you a reason to replay the game for things other than the endings. Sekiro is by and large one of my favorite games I've played from the last few years. It is short, which I'm not too fond of, but I do understand why. For what it is, Sekiro is a modest game that focuses on fun just as much as it focuses on challenge. I hope to see this reflected later on in FromSoft's other games like Armored Core 6 and other games of that sort going forward. Elden Ring, Elden Ring, Elden Ring. My ranking for this game is low. Now, if you're smart and not the average Souls fan, then you'll understand that this low ranking does not mean that I think the game is bad. For those of you who are the average Souls fan, I'll be back behind the Denny's when you're ready to throw hands. I thoroughly enjoyed my first 3 runs of Elden Ring. I've enjoyed other runs, but the first 3 were my favorites. These were my main run and my 2 New Game Plus runs for the other ending achievements. After I finished my 3rd run of the game, I had pretty much seen everything. There were a few quests I hadn't done and several weapons I had never used, but in terms of bosses, dungeons, seeds, and everything else offered by the game, I had seen it or I had done it. There is always somewhat of a disconnect once you finish everything in a game, but with most games, you eventually come back around to playing them again. With large games and open world titles, however, it is a lot harder to want to return to those games. Elden Ring is a massive game, and as such, finishing everything took a long time. So it made sense when I didn't want to play it again after a month or 2. The issue for me came when months later, around December, I was faced with the prospect of replaying Elden Ring. I thought about it for a few days, and the whole time I just really didn't want to do it. I did eventually pick it back up, but I decided to avoid doing things I didn't have to do. I didn't do any dungeons, stuck to the main bosses, and tried a couple different build types, but nothing too crazy. None of the extra content apart from the main path felt worth doing again. Now, this is the part where I once again remind you that this was my experience, and again, isn't me saying the game is bad. I can't find myself wanting to replay the game much. The most recent replay I've done has been a torch-only run, which, as of the time of writing this, remains unfinished. This run has helped me to understand many bosses in the game, but it has also reminded me of why I placed the game so low on my list. The replay value of a game isn't something that I dock games for that much. What I dock Elden Ring for is its bosses and the latter half of the game suffering from too much Dark Souls 2 influence. Starting with the Dark Souls 2 stuff, Elden Ring in its endgame has a small problem with overstuffing an area with bosses. This happens all of twice, but drags my enjoyment of the endgame down significantly. One of those bosses is Gideon Ofnir. He honestly didn't really need to be there and serves to be more of a fluff boss than one that has much significance. Removing him doesn't really do much and would allow for a better boss to take his place, or better yet, making room for nothing to be there at all. The other boss is one I've already mentioned. Nothing of value would be lost if the Godskin duo got removed from the game. The boss is weak and is overall annoying to deal with. I suffered for several hours in my torch-only run trying to beat them and was only able to get the victory after a run where I played extremely carefully, this attempt being around 15 minutes in length. If the boss was like its Spirit Caller Snail variant and killing one meant that it didn't come back, then it would be fine. Even better would be if a completely different boss like Commander Nile was there, of course without the summons. My other issues with the game's bosses have to do with how the gameplay works on a functional level. Elden Ring gives you a lot of tools to win your battles. Some of these tools are much better than others, and some are so powerful that it would be foolish not to use them. Because of this, FromSoft had to balance the bosses around all of it at the same time, which works until it doesn't. Some bosses towards the start of the game feel better to fight because you don't have nearly as many tools to take them on with. These bosses offer a challenge while not feeling too oppressive on certain builds. At the end of the game, there are too many bosses that don't allow for good windows for things like spells or charge attacks. These things are possible, but are difficult to pull off consistently without waiting for the right set of attacks or using summons. Now, I'm not saying that all the bosses need to be made easier or be balanced around every build. What I am saying is that they should keep their challenge while being friendlier to other gameplay styles instead of assuming the player is using one build or another and working against it. Doing a strength run with no summons and no bleed or frost damage is one of the hardest runs you can do. Most of your fights will boil down to how long you can survive while you build up a stun. This is similar to the other Souls games, which is where my second issue with the bosses comes in. Other Souls bosses do not damage you for nearly as much as Elden Ring's bosses do. You can get by nicely with light armor and 50 vigor in those games. In Elden Ring, however, having that same setup feels no different than having 25 vigor and no armor in the other games. Many of Elden Ring's bosses will throw out massive combos where if you miss even one dodge, you will be hit by the remaining attacks, 2 of which are enough to kill you even with high vigor. Having high health feels necessary in Elden Ring on the chance that you do get hit. That way the fight doesn't end after you get hit once or twice. Having heavy armor helps a ton, but I would rather not need it to survive a set of basic attacks from a boss. Now, I will admit that I am blowing this out of proportion a little bit. It does feel like this though because of how fast bosses can be and how many combos they will throw out with little hesitation between them. I guess what I'm getting at is that Elden Ring's bosses are still good, but they aren't great. They try to account for too many aspects of the gameplay. This can't entirely be avoided because the game simply functions that way. When a game has multiple options while trying to always account for each of them, the quality of some things can end up suffering. So I don't entirely fault Elden Ring for having boss problems. It is intrinsic to the style of game that Elden Ring is. Again, I have to remind you that I don't believe the game to be bad. I really do enjoy the game. Remaking my Soulsborne tier list based on overall quality, Elden Ring jumps from 6th place up to 2nd place. It is the most polished of the Souls-like games, and without Sekiro in the list would be at the very top in terms of quality. I'm glad that people enjoy it and have been using it as a chance to go back and play the other Souls games for the first time. I do miss when being a Souls fan was fairly niche, but at the same time, it is good to see so many new players starting their journey with the series. A journey that they can one day talk about in a YouTube video like I'm doing right now. Like many other players, I am waiting excitedly for the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC and hope it to be the best FromSoft DLC yet. I can't wait to play it and enjoy every second. In the meantime, I'll play through these games and continue my journey with the Souls series. Life got you down? Did you watch the whole video up to this point and were super bored the whole time? Well then, this segment is for you! Before I wrap up this video, I'd like to mention some of my favorite parts of the series. Just to make this a bit more condensed, I'll be sticking to a format for this section. That way I can avoid droning on and on about stuff when I could get my point across in 1 or 2 sentences. What I'll do here is go game by game from Demon's Souls all the way to Elden Ring, mentioning my favorite and least favorite area and boss. I'll also go into why, but I'm keeping the why to a sentence or 2. Okay, rules are set, let's go. For Demon's Souls, my favorite area hands down is Latria. I am a sucker for Lovecraftian horrors, and Latria is full of that kind of thing. The dark atmosphere and enemy design hold a level of cosmic horror that wouldn't be seen again until Bloodborne. My least favorite area has got to be the Valley of Defilement. This area can be fun, but it's slow to progress through and the enemies can be annoying. Some good loot, but otherwise it's a snooze fest of an area. My least favorite boss being the Man-Eaters. The fight is alright, but the AI for the Man-Eaters is kind of dumb. They tend to be flying more often than not, and are pretty annoying to deal with as a gank. My favorite boss hands down is the Flame Lurker. The Flame Lurker is really cool despite being the hardest boss you could possibly fight in the early game. Nice design, good challenge, keeps you on your toes and teaches you how to adapt to a varying challenge. Moving on to Dark Souls, my favorite area has got to be Undeadburg. The theme of ruin is strong here and it really helps push that this is the fall of a great kingdom. I like the theme of nature reclaiming the land and it serves as a great starting point for the trilogy. My least favorite area is the Demon Ruins. What more could I say than copy-pasted enemies and a copy-pasted boss? It's boring to traverse and has relatively nothing going for it. My least favorite boss in the entire game is Bed of Chaos. Not much else to say there, it's a pretty self-explanatory boss to hate. The fight is a gimmick, and even then, it is not a good gimmick. My favorite boss from the game is Manus, Father of the Abyss. He's my favorite fight because he does not hold back. Manus was a challenge to me even with the Mountain of Souls experience I had when I fought him. Very polished fight, and you can summon Sif to help you. 10 out of 10. Dark Souls 2 is a tricky fish for favorites and least favorites, so this might change in a month or 2 when I replay the game. My favorite area in Dark Souls 2 is, without question, the Old Chaos. This is more of a boss arena than an actual area, but I don't really care because it looks awesome. The drop into the area is unforgettable, lava flowing into a massive hole in front of the arena underneath a huge root system, the Gate of the Ivory King rising up out of the lava when he's ready to fight. It is simply the best segment out of everything in Dark Souls 2. My least favorite area in Dark Souls 2 is the Black Gulch. There is nothing good about this area, especially not if you've spent hours here farming souls off the giants in the lower cave. Random invasions in an already tight area, a lackluster boss at the end, and poison-spitting statues everywhere make it into easily the worst area in the entire game. As for the bosses, the worst in the game in my opinion is the Throne Watcher and Defender duo. These guys revive each other, differ only slightly, and are an annoying balancing act for the player. My favorite boss in the game is Sir Alon. Sir Alon has one of the worst run-ups in the entire game, but more than makes up for it with how well designed his fight is. This fight feels like a true challenge between warriors, and if you manage to do it hitless, then you get a unique death animation. Bloodborne has some of my favorite designs out of the whole Soulsborne series, my favorite area being the fishing hamlet. There's something about a village transformed into a rotting mess of fish people and barnacles that I just love. This can all boil back down to the cosmic horror theme of the game, but I like it for what it is. My least favorite area is the Forbidden Woods. The area has its moments, but for me is boring after you run it a couple of times. Enemies are alright, but the area is just a slog to get through when you're just trying to get to the mid-game quickly. Both my favorite and least favorite bosses in Bloodborne are in the DLC. As bad as the living failures are, I can't pass up my disappointment with Lawrence. Lawrence seemed like he'd be a much cooler fight, but ended up being a reskin of the Cleric Beast, but with fire lava stuff coming out of him. Easily my least favorite fight in the game because of that. My favorite fight being Orphan of Kos, who I have already discussed extensively. It's such a good fight and is a fitting end to the nightmare of Bloodborne's world. Dark Souls 3 is a tricky fish with favorites and least favorites. For areas, it's pretty simple. My favorite area in the game is Irithyll, the Boreal Valley. Irithyll is a visually peaceful snowy town, seemingly frozen in time. Bonus points for being at the foot of Anor Londo, where Gwendolyn is being eaten alive by a flesh monster. My least favorite area in the game is once again the Demon Ruins. 2 for 2 on the Demon Ruins being terrible here. The Demon Ruins is now an optional side area to another optional side area that also isn't the greatest. The worst part about it being that it's a reskin of the Catacombs. For the bosses, my least favorite is Champion's Gravetender. I can't bring myself to want to fight this guy and his stupid wolf. The arena is alright, but sucks once the wolf comes out and starts rushing me without reprieve. My favorite boss on the other hand is Midir. Midir is such a cool fight in so many different ways. The climactic ending with him being staggered is one of the best ways the fight could have ended. My favorite part about the fight hands down are his attacks, the big laser to be specific. Sekiro Shadows Die Twice is a hard game to decide with. For my favorite area in the game, I'm going with the Fountainhead Palace. The area itself is beautiful. It has some of the most unique enemies in the game, and the Great Carp is a very memorable mini-boss. My least favorite area in Sekiro is the Sunken Valley. The entire area is pretty dull and can be tricky to move around without getting slapped by a sniper from across the cliffs. My least favorite boss in Sekiro is the Folding Screen Monkeys. This fight was good the first time, but the next 4 times I fought them all sucked. Gimmick fights can be good, but on replays they mostly suck, which is why many of my least favorites are all gimmick fights. My favorite boss in Sekiro is Sword Saint Ishin. Like Orphan, I have already talked about this boss enough. I like it. Good test of skill, very memorable and rewarding. S tier. Elden Ring is still evolving in my mind, but that is only for my favorites. My least favorites are very much so cemented in their place. My favorite area in Elden Ring being Leyndell, the royal capital. Leyndell is a city of holy light, right under the Erd Tree, the center for the Golden Order and one of 2 areas in the game to completely change thanks to your actions during the game. My least favorite area is the Lake of Rot. The area's design is cool, but it's a small, pretty lame area with little reason to explore if you're not trying to stack buffs or get upgrade materials. For my least favorite boss, you can probably guess what that is. My favorite boss in the game is Mohg, Lord of Blood. Mohg is one of the few bosses in the game that allows you to feel sufficiently powered with any build. I didn't like it at first, but the fight grew on me, especially during my torch-only run. The Dark Souls and greater FromSoft Souls-like series have affected a lot of my life over the years. Without these games, I wouldn't have learned to push past challenges and overcome anything in my way. At least I wouldn't have learned it as early. Despite the flaws in these games, I still love them dearly. Each game to me is at least a 9 out of 10. I truly wouldn't be the same without them. A couple of things I haven't mentioned yet about this series are the music and the themes of the games. Like many games, I didn't get to appreciate the music until much later when I actually started caring and paying attention. Dark Souls' music sets a grand scale for each fight, either conveying the power and importance of the fight, or the personality of the boss itself. I love the music in these games because it's just good. Each track tells a story, sets a tone, allows you to sink into the notes that tell the tale of a world on the brink of collapse. Some songs are somber and sorrowful, implying the sadness of a certain area or moment. Others are calm and imply the safety and security of an area, like Firelink, Shrine, or Majula. Most songs, however, are grand orchestral tracks that boom loudly into the silence of the Souls worlds, screaming a boastful tune, building a city of volume that conveys the boundless ecstasy of violence that the bosses deliver during their fights, and I cannot get enough of it. These songs go hand in hand with the game design throughout the series. Dark Souls' grand music extensively orchestrates the dark fantasy world you explore in the games. The dark somber tracks, and most of the time silence, all seeping their way into each crevice of the world. These games are among my favorite games of all time, but are far from being my favorite game of all time. The main reason I love them is the atmosphere they have. Atmosphere and setting are my favorite parts of games, my favorite type of both being somber and post-apocalyptic. I won't go into that in this video because that's for a different video altogether, but I want to express that these are important things to me in games. The Souls series has soul to it, and that soul exists within its setting and the atmospheres presented for this setting. If you haven't tried to yet, then I recommend going back through these games and letting their settings sink into your psyche. Pay attention to the music and the designs of the worlds of the Souls games. It'll help you to appreciate the games even more if you're also a fan of dark fantasy worlds. This small collection of games will forever be special to me, and I can't thank the teams at From Software enough for them. Again, I thank Hidetaka Miyazaki and his teams for giving me the opportunity to play these games, and I thank them for creating these worlds for me and millions of others to explore. As I end this video, I want to leave you all with one thing. I hold these games with such high regard because they deserve to be. These games are some of the few out there these days that don't seek to copy another style or gimmick. They seek to perfect themselves with each title, borrowing little from the outside world and sticking to what they have themselves, each game playing differently from the others. These games are some of the few games nowadays that feel authentic. There are plenty like them, thousands even, but from a big developer with millions of fans, these games have become a rarity. These are what games should be, finished products that offer challenges and rewards for overcoming those challenges. They have DLC, but those DLC expand their respective games. They don't just fill in holes where the game suffers from a lack of attention. These games are games, and they do a good job at being games. I'm glad to have spent the better part of 7 years with the series, and I can't wait to take it further. I'm excitedly waiting for Armored Core 6, and no, when it comes out, I will not be adding it to the Souls series list like I did with Sekiro. Maybe someday we'll get a new game from FromSoft that is identical to Elden Ring or these Souls games. If we do, then that would be great, but for now I'm excited to see what they do next. If Elden Ring's DLC ends up being the final door to close out the Souls style, then that is okay. I hope to one day see the Souls formula get truly perfected. If that ends up being through a modder's hard work or from a different studio, then that's also okay. All I really want is for people to play and enjoy these games, the same as I have. So here's to FromSoft. Here's to Souls. Here's to a journey that I will never, ever forget. Here's to Dark Souls.